Happy birthday, Elaine.
I shall see if I can get everybody. That's my bag.
This is very healthy for you because I'm going to have a cigarette until we're done. I burned out too.
Shall we begin?
If the cigarette isn't going, next to my elbow, words don't come. I don't know why.
Is it on?
Recording in progress.
Yeah, just so you know, you are being recorded, and then the recording goes on my Facebook page, what is it called? Whatever. I have a page, Gunilla Kester, and all the evenings are recorded there, or stored there. So I want to say hello and welcome. This is the last Buffalo Corner this season, for the reason that usually we have one in June, but me, who was featured, and Celeste Lawson, who was our major feature, she is, what do you call it, engaged in a theater production in Buffalo. Do you know where?
No.
I don't know where, but anyway, so she can't come, and I can't come because I'm going home to Sweden, where I'm from, to celebrate my mother's 95th birthday. So you have to excuse me, I won't be here in June. So what we decided, Celeste and I, was that we will open the new season in September of 2024. So tonight I am so happy to welcome my friend Gary Earl Ross and his guests, and he will host, and this is our annual Mystery Month. So Gary and his guests, I think all of them, most of them, have been such faithful and loyal friends to the Buffalo Corner Mystery Special every year, month. Yes, now you can hear me very good. But I also want, before we go on, to thank Rabbi Alex, Executive Director Joanne Marquesi, and Congregation Shir Shalom for supporting us through all these years. I think we have 5 now. It's really something. And so before I hand over the baton to Gary, I'd like to invite Rabbi Alex to share a few wise words or a poem or two.
So I'm going to keep this very brief just because I love what we're about to hear. This is one of my favorite moments of the year, and we have some amazing writers. And unfortunately, I have to go to another event halfway through, so I want to get selfishly as much as I can. And hello, all you Zoom folks. So I have one brief poem to share. This is the Dandelion Season, and this is a poem I wrote, a couple of years ago, called Dandelion Heads. Dandelion plumes stand like a military brigade in the center of my lawn. Their perfectly coiffed heads of white gloss are magnificently outer-worldly. How can tiny buds from such perfect circles of mathematical genius? By morning, half of the seeds will have parachuted out into individual battalions. The stems, half used, will bend like deflated balloons or newly shorn sheep. Later, yellow heads will emerge like newly hatched chicks, naively cooing. Pushing my lawnmower, I will decapitate each smiling face like a hated despot. But this is only the beginning of a great war, one no human can hope to prevail in. Winning would only mean an absence of those perfect white heads and the joy my kids take when they hold one in their hands and blow.
So we are in the sanctuary here at Shir Shalom, and usually we do not applaud, actually. We do this, just to say, yeah, we love it, it was good, but we don't need to. I don't know why. Rabbi, you have to tell me sometime.
It's not a performance.
It's not a performance, yeah. So now I want to say something about Gary. And what can I say about this prolific, creative, indefatigable Gary Earl Ross? He's a playwright, a novelist, a short story writer, an essayist, a poet, popular culture scholar, and he leads several writing workshops I've never dared to attend, but maybe one day I will just challenge you. He's an actor. I have heard him scream at the end of what was that play? It was the most incredible experience, I must say. And most of all, of course, he's a friend, and he's been a friend of the Buffalo Corner series since we began. And if I may tell you a mystery, some of you have already heard this story. But the first time I met Gary L. Ross was at a reading. What was the place? Can't think of it now. A big room, dark, rectangular. And I had read something. It was the first poem, probably or second, I ever wrote in English. And so I was very much a foreigner and a newbie in Buffalo and in America. And I see this man, he came walking. It's like from that door to here. That was the distance. And he came walking toward me. And I had had nothing to drink, and I had taken no drugs. But I swear to you, around his head was a crown of blue flames. It's true. And I was looking at them, and Daniel wasn't there, and I was saying to myself, Gunilla, here comes royalty. And he invited me to share a poem on his website, and he welcomed me to Buffalo, and here I am almost 30 years later. Thank you. I'll never forget that moment. So here we are. Let's welcome Gary L. Ross and his friends, Therese Papins, Lisa Marie Redmond, Susan Lynn Solomon, whom we have welcomed before. So yeah, enjoy.
Thank you. My phone just went off, which means, yes, it has been a long time, Gunilla, probably 25, close to 30 years since we met. But in that time, I have developed some issues that I need medicine for. And one, I have to take 2 pills, 7:15 every evening. Do you need a bottle of water? No, I'm good, thank you. Oh, actually, I left mine out on the, I'm fine. Murder is kind of a nasty business, but we love it for some reason. I've thought about it. I've thought about why we're engaged in this, and at the end of the evening, I'm going to read a piece that will be in my book coming out in July that may look at that, but it also may make you pause. I have to say I am pleased to be part of the writing community. Okay. How's that? How's that? Okay. I'm on the board of the New York chapter of Mystery Writers of America, and every month I do a chat for the membership called Crimecraft. And we had one last night, a really good one about short stories that influenced us. And there's something about the mystery story from the time Poe invented the detective story to now. There is something about that that pulls us in. And I was telling the story last night of a short piece published in Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine in the late 50s. It was called Dear Corpus Delicti. I won't tell you the authors, a writing team. Oh, thank you. It was called Dear Corpus Delicti, and it involved a man who murdered his wife, then went to get on a plane with his girlfriend dressed as his wife. They staged an argument. She left the plane, and he went away for the weekend, coming back, intending to find that his wife had been murdered. Now, the short story has a different twist from its more popular iteration. Before I get to that more popular iteration, I'm going to start with a TV drama called Enough Rope that was on the Chevy Mystery Show in 1960. Okay? The Chevy Mystery Show, not the Chevy Mystery Hour, the Chevy Mystery Show. And you can see this online if you go to YouTube and you look for it. And that particular episode was called Enough Rope. Later, the two authors, and let me say the detective in that was played by character actor Bert Freed. Later, the two actors expanded that 1-hour teleplay into a 2-hour stage play called Prescription Murder. And the detective was played by Thomas Mitchell, whom you may remember from Gone with the Wind, or he was Jimmy Stewart's absent-minded uncle in It's a Wonderful Life. That play was kind of successful, and it went on tour, and poor Thomas Mitchell died. Playing the detective in that play was his last role. Some years later, the authors got a chance to do a 2-hour made-for-TV movie about this same detective. Oh, I'm out of range, I see. Okay, then I will move over. Oh. Okay, I wasn't looking at the monitor there. I was trying to, is that Celia? Hi, Celia. Later, the authors got a chance to do a 2-hour TV movie called Prescription Murder. And they wanted either Bing Crosby or Lee J. Cobb to play their detective. Cobb wasn't available, and Crosby said, I'm retired. I spend my time on the golf course. But a younger actor sent them a note saying he had read the script and he would kill to play the part. That younger actor was Peter Falk. The writers were Richard Levinson and William Link. Levinson and Link had created Columbo. That was the long road to what happened with a single short story, something that they didn't let go. A short story is a wonderful thing. But mystery is a wonderful thing because it engages the intellect. So I will talk about that in a bit. But I'm here joined tonight, Therese Papins, Susan Lynn Solomon, and Lisa Marie Redman, who are 3 of my good friends and fellow mystery writers in this area. As Susan says, we kill people for a living, and I'm going to call them up, and each one will read about 10 minutes, then I'll come back and read about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a common Q&A. Okay? All right, Therese, we'll just go right down the line. Come on up.
Thank you, and thank you to Gary for always inviting us and including us. I've read here with poetry readings, so it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition. I also write mysteries and historical fiction. So the first thing I'm going to read, my character in the mystery novels is a detective, Dan Corrali. And my publisher came up with kind of an interesting idea, which was interviewing Dan Corrali as if he's a person. So I'm going to read a little bit of what the publisher came up with. Okay, introduce yourself to our readers. Where do you fit in the story? What should we know about you? And here's Dan, the voice of Dan. I'm Dan Corrali, detective on the Buffalo Police Force. I am this story. I'm a good cop, but hey, I'm not perfect. I can't get it together with my relationships, and maybe I have just a tiny drinking problem. What do you think about the author? Tell us everything, we want to know. Therese Papins could show my good side a lot more. We know I'm not perfect, but I am a good guy. What are your feelings about this story? So this was an interview about the first novel, which was River Clues. Tonight I'm going to read from Snow Clues. Let's see. Okay, what are your feelings about this story? I did a good job. It wasn't easy to solve this one. Justice wasn't done with the second death, but I tried. How do you feel about being a character in this book? I love it. It's all about how I deal with my job and my life. What do you see in your future? No spoilers, please. I'm with my sister in Budapest. Hungary is where my grandparents were from. Who knows what we'll find? Is there a sequel or another Dan Corrali book in the future? Will you be a part of it? Yes, there is. Budapest is waiting for me to figure out all the hard stuff. Say a movie producer comes knocking. What actor would you like to play you and why? George Clooney. People say I'm hot for my age. I go to the gym and keep in shape. So that's Dan Corrales, so you get a little sense. I'm going to read a little bit from Snow Clues, which actually was the original book that I wrote. And what happens is, my crime novels are not hideous, horrific descriptions of the crime itself. Basically, they're looking at the character of the people involved and also the detective. So this book starts out with November 15th, Amherst, New York. Linda Jackson put down the telephone and glanced at her kitchen clock. She could never get off the phone when her mother called. It was 4:10. Petey should have been home by now. The school bus dropped him off around 10:02. As soon as she hung up, Linda rushed to the living room to look out the picture window. It was already turning into a snowy winter. The school bus left Petey at the bottom of the driveway, so he had a hike up to the house on the hilltop. Linda's husband complained that he had to shovel and salt, but the driveway got icy, and Petey was terrified of falling down in front of the kids on the bus. Linda couldn't make out any footprints in the snow. Occasionally, the driver got delayed, so Linda wasn't worried, at least not yet. Linda put milk on the stove to make cocoa. Petey would be cold, and that was his favorite. She put oatmeal cookies on a plate. She drank the remains of her after-lunch coffee, already turned to sludge. She stood by the window to wait. Petey was so little, small for his 7 years. She kept waiting for a growth spurt, but it hadn't happened yet. He might take after her. Linda was petite and short. After 10 minutes, Linda put on her coat and boots to see if the bus had come. At the foot of the drive, she saw wide tire tracks that could have been from the bus, and then tracks in the fresh snow. Her heart started beating faster and faster. There were no more footprints to be seen. "Petey," she called out into the cold. So you have the idea that this is the disappearance of a small child. And then I'll just read a little bit more. Chapter 1. Dan Corrales sat at his desk, rummaging through a drawer, looking for a pen that actually wrote. He favored Bics, but had a bad habit of gnawing on the ends until they cracked and splintered, at which point he shoved them into a drawer. Today there were no fresh pens, so he looked for one that wasn't too badly chewed up. The blinds were drawn on the glass door of his office in an attempt to discourage interruptions, but even so, his office was rarely quiet. 2 months had passed since the missing person report was filed, and Dan knew what that meant. The kid's face was plastered all over milk cartons, and missing posters were hanging in every supermarket in town. Yet there was not one single lead. How far could a 7-year-old boy go? To heaven was what Dan suspected, and the more time that went by, the more likely the kid was already dead. It was always the good ones. Dan hadn't figured out why in all his years on the job. This one was a kid people cared about. Petey's teacher said, "He's such a smart boy, but nice too. He shares things. Everybody loves him." Wasn't that always the case? Dan took the pen out of his mouth. Okay, so I'll leave you. I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Next, I will invite up my old friend Susan Lynn Solomon, who has been in some of my writing workshops over the years. And I do need to say, Gunilla, I haven't done one in a long time. I'm coming in on 73, my next birthday, and I am close to retired on just about everything except putting words down. So, and that when I met you years ago, that whole hair thing, my hair was probably starting to turn white at that point because I've been teaching for so long. And it caught the light in a weird way. But Susan is a veteran, such a veteran of the writing workshop that I led for Just Buffalo for 6 or 7 years, that when I retired from that, she took it over. Susan?
And thank you so much for giving that to me. I am the author of the Emlyn Good Mysteries. Just as a little bit of a teaser, Emlyn is a woman who at the age of 40-something just learned she's a direct descendant of Sarah Good, who was hanged as a witch in Salem. And there's a lot about Salem and what went on there that runs through the books. And Emlyn is an author. who's constantly hunting for stories, and her boyfriend at the beginning, and her husband as we get on in the books, because there are now 10 Emlyn Good books. He's a detective in Niagara Falls, and she is what he would call a royal pain. But she wants to know what's going on and get into the middle of everything. The book I'm going to read from right now is Writing is Murder. Well, yeah, it is. It is my Halloween murder mystery. Watching the TV programs Ghost Hunters, Haunted Collector, and Ghost Adventures might give one the idea that Western New York is the most haunted corner of the United States. It actually might be. In Buffalo's Central train terminal, passengers from a bygone era still wait for loved ones who never returned from World War II. The Iron Island Museum, once a funeral home, has a man wandering the halls in search of his ashes, never claimed by his family and abandoned in the basement. A soldier roams the old Fort Niagara Castle, hoping to recover his severed head, dropped into a well by another soldier. In caves along the Erie Canal, tourists hear the voices of workmen who perished, carving the tunnels that brought power to factories lining the shores. Then there's the Rapids Theater, where a long-dead actress still performs, the Echo Club, where a brutally slain woman still parties, and Alexander Zaleski, who ran a credit union and prohibition bar in the building, moans through the night. In addition, there's the Holiday Inn on Grand Island and dozens of other sites from Chautauqua County to Orleans County. Those who have sought spirits in these dark places say they've actually seen the ghosts. None of these spirits have been known to harm the living, though, not directly. But in a few instances, it's said that one crept into the body and mind of the living and caused him to kill. Such is the story of the Bennett House. Local legend speaks of Wilson Blaine, an early laborer on the Erie Canal who was haunted by the Tuscarora brave he shot to secure the land that now sits on Park Place in the old section of Niagara Falls. It's claimed that as Tuscarora died, he cursed Blaine and all who would thereafter live on his land. Whether the result of the curse or too much liquor, during a blizzard in 1827, Blaine slaughtered his wife and 2 children, shot them, cut off their heads, arms, and legs, then shot himself. That was the scene reported to the Army at Fort Niagara when neighbors stopped by the stone house after the spring thaw. Through the years, lightning strikes burned rural structures built where Blaine had once dwelt. And people moving along the canal to settle in West died while seeking shelter on that land. This is what the guide told my father and me during a Halloween ghost tour when I was 12. I mention this particular legend because 5 years ago, the ghost of the Tuscarora Brave struck again. At least, the attorney, Howard Klein, attempted this defense at Richard Bennett's trial for the murder of his wife in their home on Park Place. Here's how Klein presented the curse in the court. After being sworn in, Police Sergeant Dan Cummings testified he had been on duty in the Main Street precinct at 8:49 on the evening of February 7th and received a call from a hysterical woman who identified herself only as Shari. The woman said her husband had gotten drunk and was threatening her with a knife. When the time came for cross-examination, Howard Klein rose at the defense table in the blonde wood paneled courtroom. "If you received that call at precisely 8:49, he began. "I believe that's what you just said, officer." "Yes, sir," Cumming replied. 8:49. "Precisely?" "Yes, sir. I marked the time in my log." Dressed in the same black Perriella suit and red and white power tie he'd worn each day of the trial, Klein stepped behind the defendant. With his hands on Bennett's shoulders, he said, "Apparently you didn't find the situation terribly serious. Maybe a prank or something?" "What do you mean? Of course I took it seriously," Dan Cummings replied. "Did you?" Klein said. "Doesn't seem you did. After all, no one responded to the call until..." He leaned over the table and pulled a page from a manila folder. 11:15 or thereabouts. An aging cop near retirement, Sergeant Cummings sat up straight in the witness box. His lips went tight and the lines deepened around his eyes that appeared as though they had seen too many similar cases. It took that amount of time because the line went dead before she gave me her full name, her address, or any other information. We were working on getting the location traced. Thank you, officer. Now tell me. But I knew the situation was serious, all right, Cummings continued, because I heard the defendant shouting and cursing in the background. Objection, Your Honor, Klein shouted. And the woman screamed just before the line went dead. Your Honor, Klein said. People in the gallery twisted in their seats and whispered to each other. Judge Aldonado rapped his gavel once. I'll have order here. His gray hair in stark contrast to his black robe, he sat back in his chair with lips pursed. Your objection is overruled. You opened the door on this, counselor. Grumbling, Klein took his seat behind the defense table, whispered to Richard Bennett, then patted his arm. Bennett shrugged. Detective Chief Harry Woodward testified next. After a few questions in which Dan Pettit, the prosecuting attorney, established that Chief Woodward was the first officer to enter the house, Pettit said, I know you found a horrid scene, Detective, one you'd rather not recall. The judge raised his hand to stop Howard Klein as he began to object. But please tell us what you saw in the Bennett's living room. The head of the Niagara Falls Detective Squad appeared to be uncomfortable in the witness box. Perhaps it was the memory of that night of February 7th, or maybe because a man 6.5 feet tall, his knees locked to be nearly pressed against his chest, twisting sideways in the chair, he rubbed his hand up his forehead and across his crew-cut gray hair. I saw the deceased on the floor between the living room and the dining room, Chief Woodward said. She appeared to have been stabbed a number of times. The crime scene tech told me he counted 16 wounds, several of them across her neck, almost severing her head. The ME has since confirmed this. Objection, hearsay, Klein said. Sustained, Judge Aldonado replied. Detective, please stick to what you personally know. Yes, Your Honor. Chief Woodward leaned forward, directly addressing Pettit. I found the defendant asleep on the couch with an almost empty bottle of scotch on the floor next to him. He held a bloody knife against his chest, as if he was cradling a baby. The DNA report, he shifted in the witness box to look at the judge. I've read the report and it's already been admitted in evidence. Glancing at the flag to his left, the New York State coat of arms on a blue field, the judge said, only what you personally know, Detective. I apologize, Judge. Where was I? Harry Woodward looked down at his notes. Oh yes, the curtain on the windows had been partially torn from the rods. One of them was completely off and wrapped around the deceased's arm and waist. Again he consulted his notes. I saw smudged blood and a trail from the banister at the staircase to the second floor, to the arch that separated the living room from the dining room. It looked like the deceased had crawled that far before she died. So, it appears that Mrs. Bennett bled out from the initial stab wounds, but even then the defendant sat on her. And Pettit made his slashing motions, continued his vicious, Your Honor, Attorney Klein rubbed his hand over his slick back black hair. He sounded put upon. Sustained, spare us the theatrics, Mr. Pettit. To the jury he said, no evidence has been presented to support this. Years younger than his opponent, in his creased brown suit, the prosecutor turned and smiled at the jury before asking, could an intruder have broken into the house? We saw no signs of forcible entry. The front and back doors were locked, the windows also. We examined each of them, no indication they'd been forced. Took a locksmith to get us inside. The prosecutor lifted a photo from the table. May I approach the witness, Your Honor? When Judge Aldonado nodded, Pettit handed the picture to Chief Woodward. This photograph has been entered in evidence as Prosecution Exhibit 23B. It's a picture taken that night by the crime scene photographer. Is that correct? The detective chief examined the photo, showing a somewhat overweight, short woman. Shari Bennett had been no more than 4'10", with small eyes set close and a wide oval face. Her auburn hair had been shoulder length until the killer apparently cut it off. The picture showed her hair in clumps on the floor. Yes, this is what it looked like the night of the murder. Chief Woodward handed the photograph back to Pettit. After showing the crime scene picture to the jury, the prosecutor asked, "This wasn't the first time Richard Bennett had a knockdown drag-out with his wife." The attorney hesitated for a beat, as if waiting for an objection. When none came, he said, "Was it the first time, Chief?" "No, it wasn't." Again, Harry Woodward leaned forward, this time peering at the defendant. "When I examined our files in preparation for this trial, I found 8 other complaints over the past 3 years." Now the defense attorney had his turn to question the witness. "There are other complaints in your files, aren't there, Chief? Complaints from my client, the defendant." He turned and looked down at Bennett. Complaints that his wife, the deceased, had attacked him, once with a tire iron, then with a kitchen knife. "Objection," the prosecutor called out. "Counsel is testifying." "Sustained," the judge said. "Do you have a question for this witness, Mr. Klein?" The defense attorney cleared his throat. "Yes, Judge, I have a question. It's the house, isn't it, Detective? The house and the land it's built on." "I don't know what you mean." Chief Woodward looked truly puzzled. "Don't you, Detective? Don't you really?" "Objection. Look in your files all the way back to 1820. Dan Pettit jumped to his feet. "Objection, Judge." Sustained. Howard Klein refused to stop. "Time after time on the same parcel of land. It's the Tuscarora curse, isn't it, Chief Woodward?" Judge Aldonado pounded the gavel. "I said sustained, Mr. Klein. You sweated my client for hours and he didn't confess, did he?" White spittle covered the lawyer's thin lips. "Over and over he told you he was having a drink in front of the TV, and that was the last he remembered until—" "That's enough, Mr. Klein." The judge's face had turned an angry red. "One more word and you're in contempt." The defense counsel caught his breath. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped perspiration from his forehead. "I apologize, Your Honor. I just wanted the jury to witness what happens when that damn Tuscarora's ghost takes over your mind. My client isn't guilty, you see. There's no mens rea. He had no criminal intent when—" The judge also caught his breath. "Save that for your summation, counsel." With a sly smile, Klein took a seat at the defense table. The Tuscarora curse defense failed, and Richard Bennett was sentenced to life in prison at Attica. While ghost stories make good books, television, and films, Judge Aldonado instructed the jury its decision had to be based on the current facts, not ancient legend. I know the jury heeded the judge's instruction because I sat on that panel. The problem with the decision we made in the Bennett case was that the matter didn't end there. As I said, writing is murder. Thank you all.
I first met Lisa Marie Redmond when we both ended up published in the same anthology, Buffalo Noir from Akashic Press in Brooklyn. They do noir anthologies for cities all over the world. Wonderful collections of stories. And Lisa has the advantage over many of us because Lisa's a retired police officer. So she knows police procedure, which I write private eye stories because I don't know police procedure. I do have a cop son, but you know, he's good for consulting on some things. But anyway, Lisa's a sweetheart, and it has been my pleasure to know her. I forget how many years it's been at this point.
It's been a while.
Yes, it has.
Years now.
Yes.
It's been so long that Gary actually doesn't remember the actual first time that we met, but I do. It was at the Downtown Public Library for their Indie Author Day, and I had only published a short story in a different anthology. The Buffalo Noir had not come out yet, but Gary Earl Ross sat next to me with his Edgar Award, which is the Academy Award of mystery writing, and I sat in awe, a brand new mystery writer, next to this man who literally achieved the highest award from our peers that you can get, and he actually let me hold it. And to this day, he probably doesn't even remember that day, but I do have a picture of us sitting together, and if you look at me, I have a little look of awe and admiration. And I just want to thank Gary for bringing us all out here. And I will always be in awe of Gary because he is a master craftsman when it comes to mystery. And my name is Lisa Marie Redmond, if you didn't catch that. And I'm saying this punnily because I'm going to read from Catch Your Death, my latest book in my cold case investigation series. And one of the things people ask me, because I was a cold case homicide detective, is how do you choose the cases you're going to investigate? And the passage I'm going to read from this book kind of illustrates just how that can happen. There was an old saying in the cold case homicide office, never be the person to answer the phone first thing on a Monday morning. Buffalo Police Detective Lauren Riley had forgotten what day it was when she snatched up the receiver on her desk. She and her partner Shane Reese had come in for overtime the day before and had thrown off her internal calendar. When the caller started talking without even saying hello, she should have known to let it go to voicemail. My ex-old lady set up a guy for a mob hit. It happened in 88 or in 89, I think. The voice on the phone sounded agitated and put out, as if Lauren had called him about an offer for an extended warranty for his vehicle, rather than him calling the cold case office to give them information on a homicide. They found him duct taped to a tree behind Barrow's pawn shop off of Military Road on Riverside. I know the case, Lauren replied, pen hovering over the yellow legal pad on the desk in front of her. Julian Fata. She bit back the urge to correct the man on calling someone his old lady. It had always been one of those phrases that had really ticked her off. And while this man sounded much older than her 41 years, she doubted ever called his significant others anything else. The restraint in her tone of voice made her partner look up from the iPad he was working on across from her. Reese cocked an eyebrow at her as the caller went on. Do you know she got $50,000 to keep him at his shop after closing time until one of the Magary brothers showed up? She was there when Salvatore Magary beat him to death and then took him out back behind the shop and taped him to the tree with his hands over his head. That was a warning to anyone else who serves. Shirley wasn't even mentioned in that file. When Reese had first come to the cold case, their captain at the time had made him go through all the mob-related files and make copies for the feds who were trying to put together a RICO case against a couple of key players. When the case fell apart, but not before Reese had become intimately familiar with every mob hit in the past 50 years, Reese continued to investigate those crimes. He got up and crossed the room to a huge olive green cabinet, twisting the handle, and he threw the door open, revealing box after box labeled in green writing, Reese's own personal filing system designed to denote organized crime cases. Fata, 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 he mumbled, his finger dragging down from one box to the next. Lauren knew they had exactly 15 unsolved mob cases going back to 1975. The older ones were archived. Here it is. Reese turned back, waving a thick manila file at her. It wasn't the original. Reese had all the originals stored away in the file room under lock and key and video surveillance. It was one of the copies he'd made for the RICO case. He took it over to the mess table and started to pull out pieces of paper one by one, arranging them in separate piles, all while muttering under his breath. Lauren watched him furiously for a moment and then walked over. The caller had long hung up on her. Reese was a ball of nervous energy when nothing was going on. Throw a hot lead at him and he exploded into action. Here's the medical examiner's reports, he said, angling it up in the left-hand corner. Statement, statement, evidence report, neighborhood canvas, statement. He quickly and methodically sorted every piece of paperwork, taking his time walking through the process and talking himself through the process. The mess table was simply a plastic and metal folded table, the kind used for basement church parties and planners to set crock pots on or display your treasures in your driveway during a garage sale. Some long-retired detective had brought it in before Lauren had transferred to the cold case squad, and Reese had made sure it survived the move from the old headquarters building. Hector and Reggie didn't use it as much as Reese and Riley did, but every cop had their own way of doing things. Reese examined a statement, let it drop back on the pile, and then picked up another report. Nothing, he said, putting one down and grabbing another one. No mention of the infamous Shirley Gizzo anywhere. Fata was married, It is possible that she was having an affair with him at the time. Lauren had a passing knowledge of most mob cases, but she'd actually read the FATA file a couple years back at Reese's urging. Reese had resubmitted all the evidence for further DNA testing and gotten some interesting results. And after months of combing over the original file, the new evidence, and re-interviewing witnesses, nothing had panned out. When the higher-ups in the Bureau decided against trying to put together a RICO case, they handed all of their findings back to Reese, and he found that he didn't have enough evidence to make an arrest on any of the individual cases. The mob knew how to cover their tracks. The FATA case got added to the file cabinet, where it sat getting colder year by year. Shirley Gizzo wasn't opposed to dating married men, Reese replied, and she wasn't opposed to doing favors for them either. She could have been dating one of the McGorry brothers at the time. Either way, it's not out of the realm of possibility she was involved somehow. The big question is, will she talk to us, Lauren asked, absently running her fingers through her short, choppy hair. How loyal is she after all these years? Loyal enough to still be alive. He dropped the crime scene photos on his desk. Still, we should take a shot at talking to her. Lauren took a sip of cold black coffee from her hot pink mug that said, "Greetings from fabulous Las Vegas." She'd have to have Reese stop for a refill at Tim Hortons on the way. Let's go then, no time like the present. Walking back over to his desk, he straightened a picture of his almost 5-month-old son out and snatched up his keys. You always said, all it takes to break a cold case is one thing. Let's see if this is that one thing. And that's how a cold case starts.
I have been pretty lucky in my life in terms of writing and whatnot. I mean, I haven't gotten rich, haven't gotten on the New York Times bestseller list, but I've been pretty lucky. At this point, 5 novels published, nearly 100 short stories published, 11 plays produced. You know, I've been out plugging and so forth. And I have to attribute a lot of this to my mother. I'm going to tell a quick story about her. My mother, I think, recognized where I was headed before I did, because she passed books to me a lot when I was young. I'm 9, 10 years old, and she's passing books she read to me. And I read a lot of adult novels before I turned 13. And she also passed mystery stories to me. We watched Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and and so at some point, my dad is reading Mickey Spillane, my mother is reading a Hitchcock anthology, and we're seeing programs on television. Right now, I'm doing my morning exercise ritual to recordings of 77 Sunset Strip, for those of you who remember that, another PI series. And so I was pretty lucky in that I had an environment that had books and mysteries and discussions and so forth. One of my favorite books from that time that my mother gave me when she finished was Alfred Hitchcock's Stories for Late at Night, a wonderful anthology. I had that book with me my entire life. Every place I lived, every job, couple marriages, that book went with me everywhere. Then one day, about 18, 19 years ago, I couldn't find it. It was gone. So I got online, found one in England. It cost me $50 to get it and have it shipped to Buffalo, and I reread it promptly when I got it. And I say that because all the years I've written, all the years I've published and so forth, this past month is the first time in my entire career that I actually ended up in Alfred Hitchcock's Mystery Magazine. So, Ma, wherever you are, this one's for you. Now, I'm not going to read the whole story for this. I'm going to read the introduction to the story because I do have some things I need to say. My mystery series, the Nickel City series with P.I. Gideon Rhymes, has 4 books in it. And the 5th book will be out this July, Nickel City Monsters. And it's a collection of short stories that are about not just Gideon Rhymes, but the people in his universe, the people in his world. That book may be the last Gideon Rhymes book. My publisher is going through some things right now, and I'm not going to talk about that stuff because I know this will be online. And if If that publishing company is merged or purchased, and they're interested in continuing Gideon Rhymes, I'm good to go. But if they're not, I'm not going to be looking for a new publisher to publish the entire collection, which means I'll be looking for publishers for something standalone. And I have a novel I want to work on, and also I have a play that will be out in October, so I have other things to do. But this book, the last book, will be out in July, and there will be a book launch on August 1st at Birchfield. So you may come for it then. The book is Nickel City Monsters Stories. And it won't come out until then because the stories, for the most part, with the, like five haven't been published, but the other stories in the book have been. And the last one was this and I had to wait 60 days before it can come out someplace else. But I'm going to read the beginning of this story. It's called Nickel City Eavesdropper. And I will say this. Many of you know that love of my life is Tammy. And I will say, because you're going to say, where did you get that idea? She was on the plane with me. First part of Nickel City Eavesdropper. Surprise, the breathless blonde said through her black mask. Of medium height and 40-something, if the corners of her eyes were any indication, the woman standing in the center of a jet blue plane wasn't speaking to me in my aisle seat, but to the man in the window seat in front of us. As the two stared at each other, there was enough palpable tension between them that Phoenix, beside me, lowered her crossword puzzle magazine, and I closed my book. Jerry, I have one question for you, the woman said, stuffing her shoulder bag into an overhead bin and readjusting her tan blazer. What kind of man leaves his wife standing in the middle of Times Square? Jerry said nothing through his N95 mask as she took the seat beside him. I could see enough of him to know he was likely in his 40s himself and was also blonde. When she asked again what kind of man would leave his wife alone on the street, he turned to the window. His hair was thin enough I could see his scalp redden from the crown down to the collar of his pale blue shirt. We were at JFK, with empty seats scattered throughout the plane. Masking was again required for air travel because the pandemic had shown unexpected resilience, its oft-mutating virus apparently determined to stretch into a third year. No one had announced we were waiting for a final passenger, but the woman's rapid breathing suggested she'd made it down the jetway just in time. Now she was buckling in, her respiration rate falling, but her body far from relaxed as she leaned away from her husband, as if brushing against him would give her a rash. It's going to be a long flight, I whispered to Phoenix. The longest hour of his life, she said. Maybe we should just mind our own business, Gideon. It was a Sunday in mid-October. We were returning home to Buffalo from our first real trip since Christmas. Since the Christmas we had spent at her Tia Rositas in Puerto Rico. At the height of Zoom meeting fatigue, Phoenix had been invited to Manhattan to speak at her first live law conference in almost 3 years. 5 nights in New York in a lonely hotel bed, she had said, unless you care to join me. Nearly lobotomized after 30 months of television, moronic politics, and watching terms like mask up, lockdown, and social distancing enter everyday speech, I was ready to go anywhere. And it had been a good getaway. A retired Army CID detective and working PI who sometimes consulted with police but still got law enforcement bulletins, I found 3 workshops to join but spent most of my time outside the hotel. After attending enough sessions to justify her tax write-off, Phoenix joined me in my wanderings, whether aimless walks or subway rides to landmarks and museums, including El Museo del Barrio in Upper Manhattan. 3 nights we dined at fine restaurants. Once we Ubered to a Broadway show. On the last evening, Phoenix was one of 6 Service Award recipients at the closing banquet. The next morning, after making love in sunlight, we had breakfast in bed with mimosas. Now, pleasantly tired and in jeans and casual jackets, we were strapped in, awaiting mid-afternoon takeoff. Except we weren't taking off. Though it was almost time for us to be in the air, the jet's engines had not yet fired. Through a window across the aisle, I could see we were still connected to the jet bridge. Confident, however, detachment and taxiing were imminent, I straightened my glasses and returned to my book. Phoenix went back to her crossword, a pastime no doubt responsible for how often she cleaned my clock in Scrabble. 2 pages later, a flight attendant announced over the PAs our departure had been delayed 40 minutes by a rainstorm hundreds of miles to the west. Phoenix and I exchanged a look, and she winced. I just want to take this mask off and crawl into my own bed with a book and a glass of wine. Before I could say I needed time to myself as well, the woman in front of me turned back to Jerry, who continued to look out his window. He tensed, as if keenly aware of her slightest movement. Now that I've given you time to think about it, she said, is it too much for you to give me an answer? Her voice rose enough to get the attention of passengers around her. 4 or 5 conversations died. What kind of man leaves his wife standing in the middle of Times Square all by herself? The idea of a mystery. One story, which is very short, which I will read to you, that is in the new book, Nickel City Monsters, kind of addresses that. Now, this collection contains a novelette called Nickel City Monsters and 5 Nickel City short stories. The other stories have different titles, and they're about, and in some cases by, characters inside Gideon Rimes' world. His godfather who raised him, a couple of his friends, a couple of the police officers he works with. This one is about his adoptive sister, who's a medical examiner. Among Little Monsters. Uncharacteristically nervous and clad in a pristine lab coat, Mira Papuri sat among parents gathered for career day. Shakti had nominated her when he was in 3rd grade, then 4th, but both teachers, knowing her profession, chose other parents each quarter. His 5th grade teacher explained, with a hint of indignation, "Miss Papuri, you're a coroner." "It's Dr. Papuri," Mira said, expression and voice both dripping acid, "and my official title is Deputy Chief Medical Examiner for Erie County. It doesn't matter, you'll scare the children. They'll think you're weird because you cut up dead bodies for a living." So that's what they think of me. I'm a strange little brown lady who cuts up dead bodies. Now, Shakti was in 6th grade at Dalton Middle, almost as tall as Mira, his coffee skin and green eyes reflecting both his mother's South Asian heritage and his long-absent father's Northern European roots. This time, his teacher said yes, provided there was no mention of guns. A sack of props at her feet, Mira listened to unimaginative presentations on real estate, insurance, furniture, car sales, TV reporting, the law, and food service. Most of the speakers were bland in speech and manner, as if they'd been stopped on the street and asked what they did for a living. The only ones who used props were the real estate agent who held up poster boards and a luxury home and a for sale sign that bore her picture, the lawyer who put a small statue of blind justice on the table, and the TV reporter who held a wireless microphone. As the children grew restless, Mira became more uncertain about her props and her plans. No, she didn't want to scare the children, but she didn't want them to laugh at her either, for Shakti's sake. At last it was Mira's turn. Ms. Bellavia called for the students' attention. "Doctors help us all our lives, but some help us after that. Let's welcome Shakti's mom, Dr. Papuri." Sack in hand, Mira moved to the presenter's table, the applause and the pride in Shakti's face both depositing a lump in her throat. "If I can cut open a body," she told herself, "I can face these children." She was still trying to swallow the thing when a boy said, "Do you cut up dead people?" The laugh she stifled melted the lump, and she pulled in a lungful of air. "Have you or a family member ever had an operation?" Hands went up, responses tumbling forth. "Grandpa got a heart transplant." "They took my tonsils out." "Aunt Joe got a new knee and can't wear shorts because of the purple scar." "They took out my appendix." Mira set her sack on the table and removed 2 Tupperware containers. "Operations make us better. A new heart keeps blood flowing. A new knee helps us walk. But sometimes even people who die need operations." "You operate on dead people?" The high voice held the innocent musicality of childhood. to find out why they passed away. Mira donned a surgical mask. I'm what's called a medical examiner, a death investigator. Mom loves mysteries, a freckled girl said, and the real estate agent winked at her. Are you some kind of detective? A raven-haired boy asked, eyes drilling into her. He was pale, as if the light green tie knotted around his neck cut off blood to his head. Briefly, Mira held up her badge case. I'm not a police officer, but a public health officer. If someone dies without a doctor present, I study them to make sure the cause of death was not a problem that could be avoided, like a loose step or a disease that can spread to other people. Or murder, the girl said in a shivery voice that made her mom beam. My kid didn't interrupt you, lady, Mira thought, and she cleared her throat and pushed ahead. Most people die of old age or different sicknesses, not murder. Most of the time, there's no murder, no mystery like on television. What about those who do get killed? Again, the black-haired boy with the intense eyes. Then it's a mystery. Again, the freckled girl whose smug mother refused to shush her. Mira looked from the girl to the boy, and then at the other children before her, and forced herself to smile. So who wants to solve a real-life mystery? The excitement level rose along with hands of would-be volunteers. Hands down, I have an assistant. She signaled her son, who stood. Let's give Shakti Christensen Popuri a hand. As his classmates clapped, Shakti came to the front and took an exaggerated bow which produced boos and laughter. Then he hoisted himself onto the table and stretched out on his back, his body hiding the Tupperware. Disappointed, a ginger-haired boy said, No fear, he's your son, which is why he's going to be my pretend dead body. We practiced last night. She held up a finger. First, he's not your Shakti, but old Papa Shakti, who lives with his son, Benji. Several children, including Shakti and the pouting boy, giggled. Benji, someone said. They live right here in Williamsville. Benji comes home from work one day and calls 911 to say, help, my dad is floating in the pool. Mira waited for the snickering to subside. An ambulance comes, but it's too late. How do you think Papa Shakti died? Drowned, several kids said, some pronouncing it drowned. Now you operate on him? Mira shook her head. I start by taking a good long look at him. What do I see first? Bullet holes, because somebody shot him and pushed him in the pool. They stabbed him. A black eye, because they knocked him out and he drowned. No, they electrocuted him. Mira held up a hand, pleased they were so engaged but uncomfortable they kept returning to murder. These kids watch way too much grown-up TV, she thought. But she did feel a twinge of pleasure that they fell silent for her. Children she didn't know were responding to her mind, not her gender or height or skin color. That was refreshing. What happened, Shakti? A high voice whispered, causing him to snort back a guffaw. She tapped her son's forehead. Hey, my patients can't make noise. The subsequent laughter covered the sound of Tupperware lids popping. What do I see? Think hard, Ms. Bellavia said. Think about everything Dr. Popuri just told you. After a moment, a cinnamon-skinned girl with burgundy eyeglasses raised her hand. Wet clothes? She ventured. Meaning? Mira said. No trunks. Means he wasn't swimming. The boy with the jet black hair and the only tie not on an adult neck. Apparently there was no shutting him up either. Right. Pulling up her mask, Mira produced a white plastic picnic knife. Now on to the operation to check inside him. She pretended to make an incision, her motion suggesting she was holding a saw instead of a scalpel. Laughter made her expel a breath that signaled how hard it was to operate. After more laughter, she held up a pink pillow shaped like a bean. What's this? His heart, his stomach. My mom has a neck pillow. She shook her head. It's one of his lungs. Now watch carefully. She squeezed and twisted. Notice anything? The raven-haired boy stood, crossed his arms, and looked right at her. No water. Exactly, Mira said. What does that mean? Eugene, please sit, Ms. Bellavia said. Give someone else a chance. Eugene ignored her, voice eerily calm. Means he didn't drown. Our cat died in the pool. She was full of water. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then Mira made a show of resuming the operation and held up a heart-shaped candy box, one side crushed and burnt. How did Papa Shakti die? Eugene looked around the room. At first, Mira imagined a miniature Hercule Poirot holding court in the lounge car of the Orient Express. But the more children who fell under his gaze, the quieter the room became, and the more he seemed like someone else, something else. She could not yet name it, but it was something that made the other children and the teacher say nothing. He died from a heart attack while he stood by the pool and fell in. His tone was detached, clinical, cold. Then he smiled, so faintly it seemed she was the only one who noticed. When, finally, he sat, a chill spiked through her. Mira had tried so hard not to scare the children, she never expected one of them to scare her. We will take questions, Q&A, anything, anybody. We can all come up so people can see at home. Hi, Carol. Anyone? Well, thank you.
People that kill people that can't go to jail for it.
Well, I will tell you this. I used to do a lot of public lectures on classic murder cases. And I did them, I was younger and I was doing a lot of those things. My son David came to a lot of those with me when he was 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. And after he did 3 combat tours in Iraq, he became a cop. And the first police job he had, the person interviewing him said, "You did well in everything. The physical's great." He said, "You just seem to know an awful lot about serial killers." He said, "Well, my dad's a professor who does lectures on things like that, and I went to a lot of talks with him." He said, "Oh, okay." Well, David became a cop, and he was injured on the job and eventually retired from being a cop. Last week, I got a call. "Your granddaughter wants to know something about Jack the Ripper." Huh? It seems his daughter, now 16, she came to visit last summer, and I'm thinking, this girl can drive. I changed her diaper. She can drive. It's blowing me away. But apparently she's doing some research because she might want to go into forensics. We may have started something. Thank you all for coming to, oh yes, question, okay. Every now and then, what happens is this. Tammy can tell you this is true. We're talking about something, I get this look in my eye, and you're thinking of the story, aren't you? Huh? We were driving back from, I forget where we were coming from. We were coming up through Pennsylvania into New York. And we picked up NPR, and we were listening to something. And this program started talking about a severed corpus callosum, the band of nerves that connects the 2 halves of the brain and lets the 2 halves of the brain communicate. And that causes problems if you are trying to understand things, because when your speech center is not connected to your visual center, there can be problems. So I listened to this, and I thought about it, and thought about it, and thought about it, and then I sat down to write a play, Split Wit, about the only witness to a murder who suffers from agenesis of the corpus callosum, where it didn't form, and he couldn't explain what it was he saw with his sister being murdered. And that play was on stage last year at the Robeson Theater, and I do have some DVDs of it out there. Something pops into my head, and I think, how could that be a story? And not everything makes a story, and not everything works, because I have far more ideas than I have time to write them, unfortunately. But short answer, I'm not exactly sure how it happens. It just does. Yes?
I had one request versus if you could get more in front of the mic again.
Okay.
Because it's so much clearer.
All right.
Okay. What I liked about the couple, the woman confronting her husband on the plane, like, I don't even know
Well, that was exactly what happened. We're sitting there, coming back from New York, and I was reading a Perry Mason novel, and Tammy was doing a crossword puzzle, and we were sitting there, and this woman did this, and I think the guy's name was it, what did I use in the story? Was it Jerry? Yeah, his name was Scott. And I have two good friends named Scott, so I didn't want to use that name. And we're looking at this, what is this? And of course, I spun it into something else that wasn't that. And I'll say this much, by the end of that plane ride, remember I said the plane wasn't taking off? Flight to Buffalo, it's like an hour, right? From New York. That plane sat on, attached to the jetway for over 2 hours. And I mean, this guy, I think he was a jerk, because you don't leave somebody like that, number one. But damned if I didn't feel sorry for him by the time we were ready to take off. And also by the time we landed, they were getting a divorce. That was, I mean, we got to be witnesses to that whole thing. I turned it into a murder mystery because it's kind of what I do. But there.
Similarly,
Susan, you want to come up to the microphone so you can?
As writers, we walk around with what we call our writer's journal. And I carry it with me most places. I'm making notes of the people I see, the way they speak to each other. I'm listening for accents, their body language. Are they leaning in, pulling back, that kind of thing. Gary reminded me of a time I was sitting with at the Fort Lauderdale airport coming back to Buffalo, and I'm waiting for my flight. Well, as I'm checking in, this family, very nice people, Jamaican accents, they check in just after me. There were 7 of them, children, 2 men, a woman, and I'm listening to them talk, and he's talking about all the wonderful things that they're going to see when they get to Jamaica. I made notes about all of this. Didn't know what was going to happen. On the flight on the way home, it was turning over in my mind. A month later, I was looking at my journal, and I went, oh! And it turned into a piece of flash fiction that was published in an online journal, about 3 years ago. So that's part of where ideas come from. Of course, I also like to tell people that the ghost I live with thinks that she's writing the stories and just telling me what to type, but that's how it happens for me. Sometimes it's a title that'll come up with first. Sometimes it'll be a character that I've seen on the street or something. Sometimes I just sit down and I start telling myself a story. And it just keeps going. It may not work, but as Gary said, when it doesn't, you put it in the drawer. That happened with, I think, the first novel I wrote. 180,000 words, big as a dictionary, it wasn't going to work. I put it aside. 2 years ago, I was remembering something that was in it. I thought I could use it in the story I was writing. I looked at the file, started to read it, and I said, oh my God, is that what this is about? And the words fell away, the story came together. These are the kinds of things that happened. The experiences that I'd had since I wrote that came into play, and it put it all together.
We're so inundated with mystery. I'm always amazed at PBS. Like, every single show seems to be mystery. Yes. It makes me crazy. So the thing I was thinking of, maybe it's the same with Lisa, creating an alter ego. Like, my alter ego is a detective. And I used to think, wow, you know, if I had an alter ego, he'd be sophisticated and a really cool person, very worldly. No, he's a guy with a lot of problems. A good, as someone said, a good cop, but, you know, so that's also part of it. You create someone who becomes real, you know, and you do, you know, see different moments and things that trigger your memory and trigger your thought processes. But I like the idea of having this figure who is like an alter ego. Yeah.
So I maybe have the opposite problem. So none of the stories in any of my cold case books are based on any real cases that I ever worked. And in fact, I go out of my way to make sure they are not like any of the real cases I ever worked, because this is Buffalo, and we literally are all connected. Everyone in this room, we all have a friend in common. Our cousins work together somewhere at some point. We are all connected in Buffalo, and which is one of the reasons why I love. And when I say Buffalo, we're talking about everything from Niagara Falls to Jamestown. It's really Western New York. We are all connected here. So given that I have to go out of my way to come up with something that I didn't actually work on, I have to ask myself, and maybe this is something that when you're reading, what scares me the most? What would scare me as a person, not as a cop or an ex-cop, or just what are the things that would happen that would scare me or anger me, that would make me want to find justice? And my Lauren Riley character is not me, and she's not an alter ego. She's a cop that I would never be. We are so different in so many ways. And I always say, if she was a real person, she wouldn't even like me. But I need her to be different from me. Otherwise, the truth of what she's doing wouldn't come through. And I want that always, like, just because the cases in my book are not real cases I worked on, I always say they might not be probable, but everything that happens in my book is possible. So if you're watching CSI and going, oh, could that really happen? That was a huge pet peeve of mine. In my books, everything could possibly happen. Is it likely? Maybe not. But is it possible? 100% yes. And that is what is the scariest thing about them, is that everything that I write is possible. And those are the nightmares that we try to push out, you know, out of ourselves and into our books. So that's my short answer.
I'm going to finish up with addressing that because the novelette in Nickel City Monsters is based on two very famous Buffalo murder cases. And I will not mention the killers' names, but in one case, and this happened when I was a little kid, a teenager who, you know, so you think, oh, the evil babysitter type character. She lured children into the woods or into wooded areas and got them tied up and other stuff, and she strangled one. I believe it was in Delaware Park. I relocated it for the novelette. And she ended up immediately going to a mental health institution. Every time she seemed to be getting better before she would, you know, so she could go to trial, she had a relapse. Eventually, it was recommended that she just be let go. She did, she left, and she promptly disappeared. Okay? The other case, which happened maybe 15 years later, dealt with a woman who butchered her children in her flat. And as it happens, someone who grew up with this woman was a student of mine at one point, and said she was always crazy, even when we were kids. I don't know what that means, but I pass that on for what it's worth. But this woman butchered her children, carved religious symbols into their bodies, and to my way of thinking, had an obvious mental health issue. she was not permitted to use a mental health defense. She went to prison and eventually was released, and we have not heard from her again. Now, the difference between these two cases were one young lady was white, one young lady was black. Which one got to walk away, and which one did time in prison? I won't answer that question, but I think you can probably figure it out. And so those become the basis of Nickel City Monsters, the story, the novelette. The stories are all interconnected, and there are references to things throughout the book. But I will use a real case. I will do it disguising things. I mean, my play Matter of Intent, which won the Edgar Award, was inspired by two things. One was a Buffalo case that didn't produce murder. It was an assault. And the other was the Papin sisters murder case in Le Mans, France in 1933. I invite you to look that up if you wish. But those two cases form the basis of Matter of Intent. So I will look at what happens historically, and I'll spin it into something else. Thank you all for coming tonight. And we do have books, and I have a couple DVDs of plays that I've had done. They're out in the hall for sale, so take care.
Gary, I just wanted to say thank you. No. When you come home. Therese, Lisa, Susan, thank you so much for joining us here. Megan, we have friends here tonight. It's very nice. And I just wanted to emphasize again that we are not having a Buffalo Corner in June because I will go home for my mother's 95th birthday. And the other featured reader we had planned has some engagement at the theaters in Buffalo, so she can't come either. Do we need to say anything else? Oh, I wanted to mention that, when I met Gary and I read the Shimmerville stories, there was one short story that I will never forget because it expressed to me what you were just talking about, which you didn't mention. And now I don't know how to say it without being too blunt, but the difference, the racial difference in America. Now, I grew up in a very homogeneous country, but in this story, there's a woman who has left, right, and married, and her parents don't like her anymore because of whom she married. And she goes home, and she meets her, huh? The frame story in that collection. Oh, it's, if you want to read a good story, read it. She goes home to visit her parents, and she meets up with her old boyfriend that the parents agreed on, right? They want him to marry her, and he ends up murdering the parents and her. Yeah. So the husband she had was actually a good man. So it was, for me, an eye-opener, Gary. In some way, the subtleness of how you describe racial difference. And so I just wanted to mention. Good night, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm so happy.